The sky over the valley was a bruised purple, torn open every few moments by silent, jagged flashes of light. No rain followed, only a wind that tasted of dust and distant alkali flats. It was a dry lightning storm, the kind that promised fire, not relief. Eli Carradine felt it in his bones, a low hum of dread that matched the rhythm of his horse's gait. He pulled the brim of his hat lower, shielding his eyes from the grit that swirled in the air. The cattle trade in Dusty Redemption had gone well enough, leaving him with a full pouch and an empty feeling, the usual trade-offs for a life lived alone. His ranch was a speck in the vast, unforgiving landscape. A cabin, a barn, and a well, all carved out of a land that seemed determined to swallow them back up. It was not much, but it was his, bought with sweat and silence. As he crested the final rise, the silhouette of his property came into view against the flickering sky. But something was wrong. A shape, small and huddled against the great wooden door of his barn, did not belong. It was not a coyote or a stray calf. It was human. His hand instinctively went to the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. In this part of the country, a visitor who did not announce themselves was either lost or looking for trouble. Eli did not get many visitors. He urged his horse, Gideon, into a slow, cautious walk. The wind whipped a length of dark red hair across the figure's form, and for a heartbeat, Eli's breath caught in his throat. It could not be. It was a ghost, a trick of the storm. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the parched soil, the sound swallowed by the wind. He was closer now, close enough to see the tattered fabric of a dress that might have once been fine, close enough to see the goose flesh on her bare arms. She was shivering, though the air was thick and warm, and she was barefoot, her feet caked with the grime of a long and desperate journey. She looked up as his shadow fell over her, and the face that met his was a ruin he knew better than his own. The fine lines of her jaw were still there, but they were sharper now, starved. Her eyes, once the color of a summer sky, were clouded with something dark and weary, but they were her eyes. "Josetta," he breathed, and the name felt like rust in his mouth. Josetta Harrow, the daughter of the man who owned the county, the man who had once owned Eli, the woman he had not seen in 6 years, not since her father, Silas Harrow, had loaded her onto an eastbound train like cattle, her face a pale blur behind the grimy glass. The whole town had whispered about it. A scandal, they said. A rich man from the east had been found for her. A quick marriage to save the Harrow name from whatever shame she had brought upon it. Eli knew the shame's name was his own. "Eli," she said, her voice a dry rasp, barely a sound at all. He stood there, a stone statue in the swirling dust, his heart a cold, hard knot in his chest. Every memory he had spent 6 years burying clawed its way to the surface. Her laugh in the hayloft, the taste of stolen whiskey on her lips, the promise he had made, a promise he had failed to keep. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice flat and hard. He would not let her see the tremor in his hands. "I had nowhere else," she whispered, her gaze falling to the ground. "Nowhere else?" he scoffed, a bitter laugh escaping him. "Your father owns every piece of land from here to the mountains. You passed a dozen ranches that would trip over themselves to help a Harrow. Go to one of them." He turned, making to unsaddle Gideon. A clear dismissal. He could not have her here. Her presence was a brand on his skin, a fire he had long thought extinguished. "They work for him," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "Everyone works for him. I thought you did not." "I do not," he bit out, pulling the saddle from his horse's back with a rough jerk. "Not anymore, and I do not take in strays, especially not Harrow strays." He did not look at her, could not bear to. He heaved the saddle over his shoulder and started for the cabin. His steps heavy. He expected to hear her rise, to hear her walk away into the storm. He did not care where she went. He told himself she had made her choice 6 years ago. living a fine life in the East while he had been left with nothing but the dust of her father's ranch on his boots and the taste of betrayal in his mouth. But there was no sound of her leaving. There was only a soft, muffled thump. He stopped, his back rigid. He fought the urge to turn, fought it with every ounce of his will, but the silence that followed was heavier than the storm. Cursing under his breath, he dropped the saddle and spun around. She was on the ground, a crumpled heap of torn fabric and pale limbs. She had fainted, collapsed right where she had been sitting. The storm lit the sky again, and in the stark, instantaneous light, he saw it. A dark, ugly bruise bloomed on her cheekbone, and when her sleeve fell away from her arm, he saw a puckered, half-healed scar, long and jagged, marring the pale skin of her forearm. The cold knot in his chest broke apart, replaced by a hot, sickening wave of something he refused to name. He was at her side in 3 long strides, kneeling in the dirt. Her skin was cold, clammy. He brushed the hair from her face, his calloused fingers clumsy against her cheek. She was thinner than he remembered, a fragile bird with broken wings. With a groan that was part fury and part pain, he scooped her into his arms. She was lighter than a sack of feed. He carried her toward the cabin, the wind tearing at them, pushing against him as if trying to keep her out. He kicked the door open and carried her inside, laying her gently on the simple cot that served as his bed. The cabin was 1 room, spare and clean, a stone fireplace, a small table, 2 chairs, and the cot. It was the life of a man who owned nothing he could not carry. He lit the lantern, its warm glow pushing back the shadows, and then knelt to build a fire. Soon, the hearth was crackling, casting a dancing light over her still form. He stood and watched her, his arms crossed over his chest. She was a specter at his hearth, a ghost of a life he had long since mourned. He fetched a blanket and covered her, his hands hesitating for a moment before tucking it around her shoulders. He saw the faint tremor of her eyelids, the shallow rise and fall of her chest. She was not just a memory anymore. She was real, and she was in his house, and he had no idea what to do. He pulled one of the chairs close to the fire and sat, the Colt still heavy on his hip. He did not sleep. He watched her, and he watched the fire, and he listened to the storm rage outside. Hours passed. The fire burned down to glowing embers, and the storm quieted to a low moan. Josetta stirred, a soft whimper escaping her lips. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then slowly clearing as she took in the rough-hewn ceiling, the stone fireplace, the man sitting in the chair. She said nothing for a long time. She simply lay there, wrapped in his blanket, her gaze fixed on the dying fire. Eli remained silent, giving her the space, letting the quiet settle between them. It was a different kind of quiet than the one he was used to. It was heavy with unspoken years, with questions he was afraid to ask and answers he was sure he did not want to hear. When she finally spoke, her voice was so low he had to lean forward to hear it. It was not a question about where she was or what had happened. It was a plea, delivered with a strange, hollowed-out stillness that chilled him to the bone. "Will you lie beside me like you mean it, just tonight?" The request hung in the air, simple and devastating. He stared at her, searching her face for some trick, some hint of the coy girl he had known, but there was nothing there but a profound, soul-deep exhaustion. She was not asking for a lover. She was asking for an anchor in a storm that had nothing to do with the weather. He did not answer. He could not. Instead, his mind betrayed him, pulling him back through the years, back to a time when lying beside her had been the only thing that felt true in the world. He remembered the first time he saw her, a flash of red hair and a bright blue dress. Stepping down from her father's carriage, he had been just a ranch hand then, barely a man, his hands raw from mending fences. She was the boss's daughter, untouchable as the moon. But her eyes had met his across the dusty yard, and a silent conversation had begun. Their meetings were stolen moments, pockets of time carved out of a world that was not meant for them. He remembered the hayloft in the main barn, the air thick with the sweet smell of alfalfa and the thrill of the forbidden. Her fingers tracing the line of his jaw, his own hand trembling as he reached to touch her hair. "You are too serious, Eli Carradine," she had whispered once, her breath warm against his ear as they hid behind a stack of hay bales, listening to the sounds of the ranch hands below. "Your father would have my hide if he found us," he had murmured, though he could not bring himself to pull away. "Then he will not find us," she had said, her voice full of a careless certainty that only the very young and very privileged could possess. She had kissed him then, a quick, clumsy press of her lips against his. It was the first kiss for both of them, and it had sealed his fate. He was lost. He had promised to take her away. He had saved every spare dollar, dreaming of a small piece of land somewhere far from Silas Harrow's shadow, a place where she would not be the Baron's daughter and he would not be the hired help. They would just be Eli and Josetta. "I will come for you," he had sworn, his voice thick with earnest devotion. "On a moonless night in that same barn. As soon as I have enough, I will come for you, and we will leave this place behind." She had believed him. She had held on to his hand and told him she would wait forever. Forever had lasted until the end of the week. Her father had found them. Not in the barn, but in a letter Eli had foolishly tried to pass to her through one of the kitchen maids. Silas Harrow had not been a man for yelling. His anger was a cold, quiet thing that was far more terrifying. He had summoned Eli to his study, the letter lying on the vast oak desk between them. "You will be gone by sunrise," Harrow had said, his voice like the slide of a knife from its sheath. "If I see your face on my land again, I will have you hanged for a thief." Eli, young and proud and foolish, had stood his ground. "I love her." Harrow had almost smiled. "You are a boy who works for wages. You do not know the first thing about love. You know about opportunity. And your opportunity here is done." Eli had been escorted to the edge of the property by two of Harrow's grim-faced men. He never saw Josetta to say goodbye. 2 weeks later, he heard the news. She was gone, sent east to marry a man she had never met. And he, Eli, had done nothing. He had not gone after her. He had not fought. He had accepted the cold, hard fact that a man like Silas Harrow could not be beaten. He had drifted for a year, then came back, buying this small, forgotten plot of land on the edge of the county, a place where he could see the distant lights of the Harrow ranch and hate himself for his cowardice every single night. A sharp cry from the cot snapped him back to the present. Josetta was sitting bolt upright, her eyes wide with terror, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She was tangled in the blanket, her hands clutching at her throat as if fending off an unseen attacker. "No," she whimpered, shaking her head violently. "No, please." Eli was on his feet in an instant, moving to her side. "Josetta, you are all right. You are dreaming." He reached for her, but she flinched away, scrambling to the far edge of the cot, her eyes wild. "Do not touch me!" He held his hands up, showing they were empty. "It is just me, Eli. You are safe here." Her frantic breathing slowed as recognition dawned in her eyes. The terror receded, replaced by a raw, painful shame. She pulled the blanket tighter around herself, hiding, her body trembling. Eli backed away, giving her space. He walked to the window and stared out at the first pale hints of dawn. The storm had passed, leaving the air washed clean and the world unnaturally still. "I can ride you into town," he said, his back still to her. "You can get the stagecoach from there. Go wherever it is you need to go." The sound that came from the bed was not a word. It was a sharp, contemptuous hiss of air through her teeth. "I did not come all this way just to run again." He turned to face her. She had pushed the hair from her face, and in the gray morning light, he could see the hard set of her jaw. The frightened girl from the nightmare was gone. In her place was a woman made of iron and fury. "Then what did you come here for?" he demanded, his own anger rising to meet hers. "Did you think you could just show up on my doorstep after 6 years and I would welcome you with open arms? Did you enjoy your fine dresses and your rich husband while I was breaking my back on this worthless piece of rock?" "My rich husband?" she spat, swinging her legs off the cot to face him. The blanket pooled around her waist, and he could see the sharp angles of her collarbones. "My fine dresses were a cage, and my rich husband was a monster." "You left, Josetta," he said, his voice low and shaking with the force of his old, buried grief. "You let him send you away. You did not even try to send word. You just disappeared." "And you never came for me," she cried, her voice breaking. She stood up, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor, and took a step toward him. "You promised me. In the barn. You promised you would come for me. I waited, every single day for a year. I stood at the window and I waited for you to ride up that long drive and take me away, just like you said you would. But you never came. Your father would have killed me," he roared, the sound exploding in the small cabin. "He told me he would hang me if he ever saw me again. What was I supposed to do? Ride in there with my one pistol against his army of hired guns?" "You were supposed to try," she sobbed, tears finally streaming down her bruised cheeks. "You were supposed to choose me, but you did not. You chose to be safe. You chose to be alive. You left me there." They stood inches apart, their bitter words hanging in the air between them like smoke. The tension was a living thing, a coil of rage and pain and something else, something deeper and more dangerous. He could smell the scent of the rain in her hair, see the frantic pulse in the hollow of her throat. He wanted to shake her. He wanted to hold her. The conflict ripped through him, leaving him paralyzed. She had destroyed his life, and she was the only thing that had ever made it feel whole. She seemed to see the war in his eyes. Her own fury subsided, replaced by a chilling calm. She took a deep breath, wiping the tears from her face with the back of her hand. "He married me to a man twice my age," she said, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. "A business partner of his, a man who liked to hurt things that could not fight back. I was his property, just like one of my father's horses." Eli felt the blood drain from his face. The vague whispers of a scandal now had a face, a brutal, ugly face. "I escaped," she continued, her gaze unwavering. "It took me a long time, but I did. And I did not leave empty-handed." Her eyes held his, and he saw a glimmer of the old fire, now honed to a sharp, dangerous point. "I know what my father has been doing. Eli, I know how he got all that land south of the river, the widows he scared off, the freedmen he ran out. I have proof, deeds, letters, proof that he has been stealing and threatening and killing to build his empire." She held her hand out, not in a plea, but in a challenge. "He has Judge Hallwell in his pocket, the sheriff, too. They are all part of it, but they are afraid of the truth. I have it, and I am going to burn him to the ground with it." She took another step, so close now he could feel the warmth of her body. "I need your help, Eli. I cannot do it alone." He stared at her, his mind reeling. This was not the girl he had loved. This was a woman forged in a fire he could not imagine. She was asking him to go to war against Silas Harrow, the man who still cast a long shadow over every corner of his life. "The town will not stand with you," he warned, his voice rough. "They are all afraid of him. They bow to Harrow." Josetta's lips curved into a faint, grim smile. The morning light caught the fire in her eyes, turning them from sky blue to chipped steel. "Then make them kneel to the truth," she said. The new day dawned quietly, the air scrubbed clean by the storm. A fragile peace settled over the valley. But inside Eli's cabin, the silence was heavy, brittle as old glass. He had not slept. After their argument, he had taken the remaining chair, leaving the cot to her, and had watched the darkness outside his window fade to gray. He could feel her awake, too, her stillness a palpable presence in the small room. Neither of them knew what to say. The ghosts of 6 years stood between them, their accusations and sorrows laid bare on the cabin floor. Josetta rose first, her movements stiff. She folded the blanket with a precision that seemed out of place, her face pale and drawn. She looked around the sparse room as if searching for a purpose, a reason to exist within its four walls. Her gaze landed on the woodpile beside the hearth, which was nearly depleted. Without a word, she walked to the door, took Eli's worn work coat from its peg, and slipped it on. It hung on her small frame like a shroud. Then she picked up his axe, its weight clearly awkward in her grasp, and went outside. Eli watched from the doorway, a muscle working in his jaw. He should have stopped her. The axe was too heavy, her hands too soft. But he said nothing. There was a part of him that wanted to see if the fire he had witnessed in her was real, if it could withstand the mundane hardship of this life he lived. He started the coffee, the familiar ritual a small comfort in the unsettling morning. He could hear the clumsy, rhythmic thud of the axe striking wood, followed by long pauses. When he brought a steaming mug of coffee outside, he found her struggling, her face flushed with exertion, her breath coming in ragged pants. A pathetic pile of splintered kindling lay at her feet. She was trying to split a log far too thick for her strength. She swung the axe again, a wild, frustrated motion, and it glanced off the wood, biting into the dirt inches from her bare foot. "That is enough," Eli said, his voice sharper than he intended. He set the mug down on a stump and walked over, taking the axe from her hands. Her fingers were stiff, and she let it go without protest. He looked down at her palms. They were raw, red, with the beginnings of blisters already forming. A small cut on her right hand was welling with blood. She snatched her hands back, hiding them in the pockets of the oversized coat. "I can do it," she insisted, her pride a ragged shield. "You will lose a foot," he countered flatly. He turned to the chopping block, set a log in place, and with two clean, powerful swings, split it perfectly in half. He did not look at her. He kept splitting the wood, the rhythmic crack and thud a conversation in itself, each swing a testament to a life she did not understand, a strength she did not possess. When he was done, a neat stack of firewood stood ready. He turned back to her. She was still standing there, watching him, her expression a mixture of shame and something else, something that looked like reluctant admiration. "You were always good with your hands," she said softly. He grunted in response, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his sleeve. "There is coffee on the stump. Drink it before it gets cold." The days that followed fell into a strange, unspoken rhythm. Josetta tried to help. She swept the floor, kneaded dough for biscuits that turned out hard as rocks, and tried to mend a tear in one of his shirts with clumsy, uneven stitches. She was a woman of fine breeding, taught to arrange flowers and pour tea, not survive on the edge of a wilderness. Every chore was a battle, every small failure a fresh humiliation. Yet, she did not complain. She simply set her jaw and tried again the next day, her quiet determination a force of nature in itself. Eli found himself watching her, his initial resentment slowly giving way to a grudging respect. He saw the woman she was trying to be, not just the ghost of the girl she had been. One afternoon, he found her staring at the Colt peacemaker he had left on the table while he cleaned it. "I used to know how to shoot," she said, her voice distant. "My father insisted. He said a woman should know how to protect her virtue, even if he was the only one who had a right to it." The bitterness in her tone was sharp enough to cut. Eli finished oiling the cylinder and began to reassemble the weapon. Knowing how and being able to are two different things. "Teach me again," she said. It was not a request. It was a demand. He looked at her, saw the flinty resolve in her eyes, and nodded slowly. He took her out to the open space behind the barn, setting up a line of empty cans on a fence post 50 feet away. He handed her the pistol. It looked heavy and alien in her grasp. Her first shot went wide, kicking up a cloud of dust a yard to the left of the target. The second was high, winding off into the empty sky. "You are anticipating the kick," he said, stepping up behind her. "You are flinching before you even pull the trigger. Breathe out slow, squeeze, do not pull." She tried again, her jaw tight with concentration. The shot was closer but still missed. "Here," he said, his voice low. He moved closer, until his chest was almost touching her back. He could feel the slight tremor running through her body. He placed his right hand over hers, his fingers wrapping around her own on the grip of the Colt. The warmth of her hand seeped into his. With his other hand, he reached around and settled it on her waist. A light, guiding pressure. "Feel my breath," he murmured, his lips close to her ear. "Match it." She went rigid at his touch. For a long moment, she did not move, did not even seem to breathe. The world seemed to shrink to the small space they occupied. The scent of gunpowder in her skin, the solidness of his body against hers. It was the closest they had been in 6 years, and the air between them crackled with a tension that had nothing to do with the pistol. He felt a familiar ache, a longing he had thought long dead, rise in his chest. He could feel the frantic beat of her heart against his hand. Slowly, she relaxed into his hold. She took a deep, shaky breath and let it out, just as he was. Her body softened against his. He adjusted her aim, his hand guiding hers until the sight was perfectly aligned with the center can. "Now," he whispered. Their fingers squeezed the trigger together. The gun bucked, the explosion deafening in the still afternoon air. The can jumped off the fence post and spun away into the dust. A small, triumphant smile touched her lips. It was the first genuine smile he had seen on her face since she had arrived, and it transformed her, chasing the shadows from her eyes for a fleeting moment. "Again," she said, her voice breathy. He stepped back, breaking the contact. The sudden cold a shock to them both. "You do it," he said, his voice gruff. "You know how." He watched as she raised the pistol, her stance more confident now. She took a breath, aimed, and fired. Another can flew from the post. She did not smile this time. She simply reloaded, her movements becoming more fluid, more certain. He was not just teaching her how to shoot. He was giving her back a piece of herself, a piece of her own power. And he knew, with a sinking feeling, that he was tying himself to her cause, to her war, with every bullet she fired. The world outside their small, isolated ranch was not as quiet as they were. A week after Josetta's arrival, Martha Gable, their nearest neighbor 2 miles down the valley, rode into the town of Redemption for her weekly supplies. While waiting for the blacksmith to see to her horse's shoe, she spoke with Sheriff Brody, a man whose loyalty to Silas Harrow was as solid and unquestionable as his growing belly. "Saw the strangest thing over at the Carradine place," Martha said, fanning her face with her bonnet. "Saw a woman at the well yesterday morning. Could not see her face proper, but she had hair the color of a sunset, just like that Harrow girl, the one they sent away." Sheriff Brody stopped polishing his badge and looked at her, his eyes narrowing. "You are sure?" "Sure as I am standing here," Martha insisted. "I know red hair when I see it. Thought it was mighty peculiar, is all. A woman like that staying with a man like Carradine." The gossip spread through the town like a prairie fire, whispered over dry goods counters and saloon bars. The Harrow girl was back, and she was hiding out with Eli Carradine, the ranch hand her father had run off years ago. The story had all the makings of a scandal, and in a town as dry and dusty as Redemption, scandal was a rare and precious commodity. Eli felt the change the next time he rode into town. He felt the eyes on him as he tied Gideon to the hitching post outside the general store. He heard the sudden silence when he walked through the door. Men who had known him for years suddenly found their boots incredibly interesting. He ignored them, walking to the counter and handing his list to Mr. Henderson, the store's proprietor. As Henderson was measuring out flour, the batwing doors swung open and a man named Caleb Thorne walked in. Thorne was one of Harrow's top men, a hired gun with cold, empty eyes and a reputation for cruelty. He walked with a swagger that came from knowing he was untouchable. He stopped beside Eli at the counter, picking up an apple and polishing it on his sleeve. "Carradine," he said, his voice a low drawl. "Did not figure to see you in town. Heard you had company." Eli did not look at him. "You heard wrong." "That's so." Thorne took a loud bite of the apple. "Funny. The whole town is buzzing about a little red-haired stray you took in. A man has to be careful about strays. They can bring trouble, sickness. Sometimes they attract wolves." He took another bite, chewing slowly, his eyes fixed on Eli's reflection in the window behind the counter. "Men who house strays," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "tend to lose their roofs. Wind blows them right off, or a spark from a dry lightning storm burns them right down. A real shame when that happens." Eli's hand drifted toward the butt of his Colt. He could feel Henderson freeze behind the counter, could feel the held breath of every other man in the store. He turned his head slowly and met Thorne's cold gaze. "If you have something to say, Thorne, say it plain." Thorne just smiled, a thin, unpleasant curving of his lips. He tossed the half-eaten apple into a barrel. "Just making conversation, a neighborly warning is all." He tipped his hat and sauntered out of the store, leaving a chill in the air behind him. Eli paid for his supplies, his movement stiff with anger. He knew the message had been delivered. Harrow knew, and he was sending his dogs to sniff at the door. That night, the fragile peace in the cabin was shattered. Josetta had been quiet all evening, watching him, her eyes full of a darkness he could not penetrate. The threat from Thorne had settled in his gut like a cold stone, and the silence between them stretched and strained. Finally, as he was banking the fire for the night, she spoke. "He will send them for me, will not he?" Eli looked up from the hearth. "He already has. One of his men paid me a visit in town today." Fear flickered in her eyes, but it was quickly replaced by that same hard resolve. She sat at the table, her hands clenched in her lap. "You should know what you are protecting, Eli. You should know what he did." And then she told him. The words came out in a torrent at first, then slowed to a halting, painful whisper. She spoke of the man in the east, a cold, brittle man named Alistair Finch, who had bought her like a prize mare. She spoke of a house that was a gilded prison, of nights filled with a quiet, methodical cruelty that left no marks on her skin but shattered her soul. She spoke of his hands on her, his breath on her neck, his whispered words telling her how worthless she was, how she was nothing but her father's tainted property. Eli listened, his hands clenched into fists, a hot, murderous rage building inside him. He wanted to ride out right then and find this Finch, find Silas Harrow, and make them pay for every tear, every moment of her terror. Then her voice broke. She looked down at her hands, her shoulders trembling. "There was a baby," she whispered, the words so quiet he almost did not hear them. "A son. He was born too early, in the middle of a blizzard. Small, but perfect." A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. Alistair would not send for the doctor. He said it was a waste of money. He said if the child was too weak to survive the winter, then it was not fit to carry his name. She choked on a sob, her body shaking. "I held him all night. I wrapped him in every blanket I could find, and I held him against my skin, trying to give him my own warmth. But he was so cold. By morning, he was gone." She looked up at him then, her eyes a well of unbearable pain. "I died that night. Eli, I really did. I just did not stay buried." The raw agony in her voice broke through his rage, leaving him hollowed out. He moved to her, kneeling in front of her chair, and for the first time, he reached for her without hesitation. He gently took her hands in his. They were ice cold. "Josetta," he murmured, his own voice thick with emotion. But she recoiled from his touch, pulling her hands away as if his sympathy were a fire that could burn her. She stood up, her back ramrod straight, her face a mask of fierce, defiant pride. "I do not want your pity," she said, her voice shaking but firm. Pity is useless. It is a blanket you give to a corpse. I do not want to be warm. I want a reckoning. She turned and went to the small, tattered satchel she had arrived with, the only thing she owned in the world. She pulled out a bundle of papers wrapped in oilcloth and tied with a string. She walked back to him and pressed it into his hand. Her touch was feverish, her eyes burning with a purpose that eclipsed her pain. This is what I want, she said. This is why I came back. He took the bundle and sat at the table, untying the string. Josetta lit another lantern, her shadow long and sharp on the cabin wall. Together, they bent over the documents, the papers a map of Silas Harrow's greed. There were maps of the Black Creek area, with property lines crudely redrawn. There were deeds of sale with forged signatures, transferring land from men and women who had been dead for months. There were letters, written in her father's own hand, to Judge Hallwell, discussing the best way to legally disenfranchise a group of freedmen who had a legitimate claim to a fertile plot of land. There was a note to Sheriff Brody, ordering him to handle a stubborn widow who refused to sell her ranch, which sat atop the only reliable water source in the South Valley. The word handle was underlined twice. It was all there, a meticulous record of a decade of theft, intimidation, and likely murder. It was a declaration of war, and she had just made him her soldier. They worked late into the night, the world outside forgotten, their two heads bent close together over the table. The anger and accusations that had separated them were burned away by this new, shared purpose. They were no longer just a man and a woman haunted by a past. They were allies. When they were done, a deep exhaustion had settled over them both. Eli stood and stretched, his muscles aching. Josetta remained at the table, her head in her hands. He knew neither of them would sleep easily. The horrors of the past and the dangers of the future were too close, too real. He turned to his chair by the cold hearth, but a soft voice stopped him. Eli? He looked back. She had risen from the table and was standing by his cot, her form silhouetted by the lantern light. She had let her hair down from its severe bun, and it fell in a dark red cascade over her shoulders. She slipped into his bed, pulling the rough blanket up to her chin. Her eyes met his across the shadowed room. Just for tonight, she whispered, her voice a fragile plea. Forget who I was. Forget that I am Silas Harrow's daughter. Lie with me like I am just yours. He stood frozen for a long moment, his heart hammering against his ribs. Every instinct for self-preservation screamed at him to stay away, to keep the wall around his heart intact. But the raw vulnerability in her eyes, the deep, aching loneliness that mirrored his own, was a pull he could not resist. He walked to the cot, his boots silent on the floorboards. He sat on the edge, and she reached up, her cool fingers touching his cheek. Her touch was hesitant, questioning. He closed his eyes, leaning into her hand. Just for tonight, he agreed, his voice a rough whisper. He laid down beside her on the narrow cot. On top of the blanket, they faced each other, their bodies not touching, but the space between them was electric. She looked at him, her gaze searching his, and in the dim light, he saw the girl he had loved, hidden beneath the scars of the woman she had become. He leaned in, slowly, giving her every chance to turn away. She did not. Their first kiss was not the fiery, desperate clash he might have expected. It was slow, hungry, aching with the weight of 6 lost years. It was a kiss of shared sorrow, of finding a familiar shore in a storm-tossed sea. It tasted of salt and dust and regret. When they broke apart, they did not speak. He simply lay beside her, his arm a solid presence at her back. She curled into him, her head finding the hollow of his shoulder, and for the first time in 6 years, neither of them was truly alone. It was not a night of passion. It was a night of solace, of 2 broken pieces finding a way to fit together, if only for a few hours. They fell asleep in the tangled comfort of each other's arms. finding a fragile truce in the heart of a war. But in the cold, gray light of morning, the truce was broken. Josetta woke slowly, a sense of warmth and safety still clinging to her. She reached out a hand to the space beside her. It was empty. The cot was cold. She sat up, her heart seizing with a familiar, sickening dread. She looked around the cabin. His hat was gone from its peg. His gun belt was missing from the chair. Eli was gone. The cold light of dawn was a betrayal. It crept into the cabin, merciless and gray, exposing the empty space on the cot beside Josetta. For a moment, a single, foolish moment. She had forgotten. She had forgotten the cold, the fear, the bone-deep certainty that she was alone. The warmth of him, the solid weight of his body beside hers, had been a lie. A temporary shelter from a storm that had not passed. It had only just begun. Eli rode hard, the rhythm of Gideon's hooves a frantic counterpoint to the turmoil in his own chest. He had slipped out before the sun was fully risen, unable to face her in the morning light. Waking up with her in his arms had felt too much like coming home to a house that had long since burned down. The comfort was a ghost, and it terrified him. He was a man who understood loneliness. It was a clean, sharp pain. The hope she brought was a messy, complicated wound. He could not sit there and talk about feelings. He could not look into her eyes and admit that her presence had undone 6 years of carefully constructed solitude. He was a man of action, and action was the only antidote to the fear coiling in his gut. So he rode for redemption, the bundle of papers tucked safely inside his coat, their edges pressing against his ribs like a promise or a threat. The town was just waking up, plumes of smoke rising from a few chimneys. He bypassed the saloon and the general store, heading straight for a small, unassuming building with the words Redemption Ledger painted in faded letters on the window. He tied Gideon to the post and went inside. The office smelled of ink, dust, and stale coffee. A small, balding man with wire-rimmed spectacles sat hunched over a desk cluttered with stacks of paper. This was Arthur Abernathy, the editor, publisher, and sole writer for the Ledger. He was a man who believed in the power of the printed word, as long as it did not upset the delicate balance of power in town. Abernathy looked up, his eyes widening slightly in surprise. "Eli, you are in town early?" "Arthur," Eli said, forgoing any pleasantries. He closed the door behind him. "I need to speak with you. In private." Abernathy nervously adjusted his spectacles. He gestured to the only other chair in the room, a rickety wooden thing piled with old newspapers. Eli cleared the papers onto the floor and sat down, leaning forward, his forearms on his knees. "I have a story for you," Eli began, his voice low. "A real story, not about the county fair or a new brand of patent medicine." He pulled the oilcloth bundle from his coat and laid it on the desk. Abernathy stared at it as if it were a coiled snake. "It is about Silas Harrow," Eli said. "It is about how he came to own half this county. It is about theft, forgery, and intimidation. It is about the men he has ruined and the laws he has broken." He explained everything Josetta had told him, everything the documents proved. He spoke of the stolen land, the fake deeds, the letters implicating the judge and the sheriff. As he spoke, the color drained from Abernathy's face. The editor's hands trembled as he reached out and gingerly untied the string, his eyes scanning the top few documents. He read one of Harrow's letters to the judge, his lips moving silently. When he looked up, his face was slick with sweat. This is dynamite. Eli, this could tear the town apart." "It is the truth," Eli said simply. "And you are a newspaper man. Your job is to print the truth." Abernathy pushed the papers away as if they were hot. "My job is to report the news, not to get myself tarred and feathered. Or worse. Silas Harrow owns the bank that holds the loan on this printing press. He owns the company that sells me my paper and my ink. If I print this, I am a dead man. My family, they would be destitute." So you will do nothing? Eli demanded, his voice rising. You will let him keep getting away with it? What you are asking is impossible, Abernathy whispered, his eyes darting toward the window. You need more than papers. Eli, you need protection. You need the law on your side. But what happens when the law is owned by the man you are accusing? You bring me a federal marshal. You bring me a circuit judge from outside this county who can guarantee my safety. And I will print a special edition. But as it stands, this is suicide. He shook his head, his expression a miserable mix of fear and shame. I am sorry. Eli, I cannot. Eli stood up, his chair scraping loudly on the floorboards. The rage inside him was a cold, hard thing. He had known it was a long shot, but the cowardice of the man, the sheer pragmatic terror that held the whole town in its grip, was sickening. He scooped up the documents and shoved them back into his coat. Thanks for nothing. Arthur, he spat, and walked out, slamming the door behind him. Back at the ranch, the morning sun was climbing higher, beating down on the small cabin. Josetta had forced herself to move, to do something, anything to keep the panic at bay. She fed the chickens, her movements jerky and unnatural. She had found a stray dog a few months back, a scruffy, one-eared mutt she named Scout, and he followed her everywhere. A silent, loyal companion. She threw him a piece of dried biscuit, his tail thumping a frantic rhythm against the dry ground. It was the dog who heard them first. His one ear shot up, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. Josetta froze, her hand on the handle of the well bucket. She scanned the horizon. At first, she saw nothing. Then, a plume of dust. 2 riders, moving at a steady, unhurried pace, coming for her. Her heart leaped into her throat. She looked wildly around. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The cabin was a tinderbox, the barn a trap. Then she remembered. During a particularly cold winter, Eli had mentioned a small root cellar he had built under the cabin, accessible through a loose floorboard beneath the cot. Scout, inside, she hissed, pushing the dog toward the cabin. She ran in after him, her mind racing. She dragged the cot away from the wall, her hands fumbling with the rough plank. It came up with a groan of old wood, revealing a dark, narrow space that smelled of earth and damp. Get in, she urged the dog, who whined but obeyed. Squeezing into the cramped darkness, the riders were closer now. She could hear the jingle of their harnesses. She scrambled into the hole, pulling the floorboard back into place over her head, plunging herself into near-total blackness. A thin sliver of light from between the planks was her only connection to the world above. She lay on the cool, packed earth, her body rigid, trying to control her breathing. She could hear the horses stop outside, the heavy tread of boots on the porch. Carradine, a familiar voice called out. Caleb Thorne. We know you are in there. Sheriff just wants a word. Silence. Josetta held her breath, praying they would believe the cabin was empty. Scout whimpered beside her, and she put a trembling hand on his muzzle to quiet him. Looks like nobody is home, Caleb, another, rougher voice said. He is here. Thorne's voice was cold and certain. His horse is gone, but the place is not empty. There was a loud thud as someone kicked the door. It did not give. Then, a splintering crash as the door was kicked open. She heard their boots on the floorboards directly above her head. Her world was nothing but darkness, and the terrifying sound of her enemies walking inches away. Check the barn. Jed, Thorne commanded. What about the girl? Jed asked. If she is here, we will find her. She cannot have gone far. A pretty thing like that, with hair like fire, stands out. Josetta squeezed her eyes shut. She heard Jed's footsteps leave the cabin. Then she heard a sound that made her blood run cold. A low, menacing growl from outside, followed by a sharp yelp of pain. Stupid mutt, Jed's voice grumbled from the porch. Get out of here. Josetta's heart broke. Scout. He had gotten out somehow. He was trying to protect the house. She heard another kick, a pained whimper, and then the sound of the dog scrambling away. Jed came back into the cabin. "Nothing in the barn but a few chickens." Then, Thorne's voice, directly above her. "He is hiding her, the fool!" There was a long silence. Josetta could hear the sound of one of them spitting tobacco juice onto the floor. Then, a stream of liquid hitting the porch. A foul, contemptuous sound that made her skin crawl. Jed was urinating on Eli's porch. A deliberate act of defilement. "What do we do?" Jed asked. "We leave a message," Thorne said, his voice dangerously soft. "The boss wants her back. He does not much care in what condition. Said he will pay $500 for her head. Double for the cowboy who turned my daughter into trash." Josetta felt a wave of nausea. A bounty, on her head and on Eli's. "500? Jed whistled. "For that kind of money, I would bring her back in pieces." "Just find her." Thorne said, "Ride down to the Gable place. See if she has been seen. I will check the South Ridge. Sooner or later, she will have to come up for water, and when she does, we will be waiting." Their footsteps moved toward the door. "Let us leave our friend Carradine a little something to remember us by," Thorne said. There was a crash of breaking glass, the sound of her carefully washed dishes being swept from the shelf. Another crash, as they overturned the table. Then they were gone. The sound of their horses faded into the distance. Josetta lay in the dark for what felt like an eternity, her body shaking uncontrollably. Every muscle ached from tension. Finally, when she was sure they were truly gone, she pushed the floorboard up and climbed out. The cabin was a wreck. The table was overturned. The chairs smashed. Broken pottery littered the floor. The door hung crookedly on one hinge. But it was not the destruction of the cabin that filled her with a white-hot rage. It was the violation, the casual cruelty to her dog, the piss on the porch, the cold, business-like discussion of her own death. And where was Eli? He had left her. He had taken her trust, her confession, her body, and then he had disappeared, leaving her to face the wolves alone. The old wound, the one he had carved into her 6 years ago, ripped open again, raw and bleeding. She was standing in the middle of the wreckage when he rode in. He saw the broken door, the chaos, and his face went pale. He swung down from Gideon before the horse had even stopped. His gun drawn. "Josetta!" he yelled, his eyes wild with fear as he burst into the cabin. He saw her, standing there, unharmed, and the relief that washed over his face was so profound it was almost painful. "What happened? Are you hurt?" She looked at him, her eyes as cold and dead as winter stars. "Where were you?" she asked, her voice a low, trembling whisper. "I went to town," he said, holstering his pistol, his mind still trying to process the scene. "I went to see the newspaper editor. I thought—" "You thought?" she interrupted, a hysterical laugh bubbling up in her throat. "You thought you would just leave me here, after last night? You left me again." "No," he said, taking a step toward her. "It was not like that. I was trying to help. I took the papers to Abernathy." "And while you were helping, my father's men were here," she screamed, the sound tearing from her throat. "They kicked my dog. They smashed your home. They stood right there." She pointed a shaking finger at the floor above the cellar. "And they talked about the $500 bounty on my head, dead or alive." The color drained from his face. "A bounty?" "Yes!" she shrieked, all her terror and rage and grief finally breaking free. "And you were not here. You left me alone to face them, just like you did before." She flew at him then, her hands balled into fists, beating against his chest. It was like a summer storm breaking, a release of all the pent-up pain. He just stood there and took it, his face a mask of anguish. And then she slapped him. The sound cracked through the small cabin like a gunshot. Her handprint stood out, stark and red, against his stubbled cheek. He grabbed her wrist, his grip like iron. "Josetta, stop!" "Let go of me!" she sobbed, struggling against his hold. "You liar! You promise and you promise and you always run!" The accusation hit him harder than her hand had. He saw the wild, desperate pain in her eyes, the terror of a woman who had been abandoned by everyone she had ever trusted. And he saw his own failure, his own cowardice, reflected in her tears. The fight went out of her as suddenly as it had begun. She sagged against him, her body racked with sobs, and he pulled her into his arms, holding her tight as she cried, her tears soaking the front of his shirt. He held her, his own eyes burning, his throat tight. He buried his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of her, the scent of his own undoing. The anger and the grief melted into something else, something raw and desperate. He tilted her chin up, and his mouth found hers. It was not a kiss of solace this time. It was a kiss of fury, of pain, of a desperate, consuming need. It was a collision, a frantic attempt to erase the years, to silence the ghosts. She kissed him back with the same wild desperation, her fingers digging into his arms, but then, with a strength he did not know she possessed, she shoved him back, breaking the kiss. She stood there, breathing heavily, her eyes blazing with a new, terrible clarity. "No," she said, her voice shaking but hard as stone. "You think I came here to fall into your arms, to be saved?" She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, as if to erase the taste of him, of her own weakness. "I came here to burn a man alive," she whispered, her voice a venomous promise, "and I will not let you or anyone else get in my way." That night, a tense, unforgiving silence filled the cabin. Eli righted the table, swept up the broken pottery. He treated the cut on Scout's leg, the dog whimpering and licking his hand. Josetta sat by the fire, sharpening a small knife on a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape of steel on the stone a grating sound that set Eli's teeth on edge. They did not speak. The chasm between them was too wide, filled with too much pain. Eli eventually fell into a fitful, exhausted sleep in his chair. He dreamed of fire and blood, of Josetta's face behind the glass of a departing train. He woke with a start in the dead of night. The cabin was cold. The fire had burned down to embers. And Josetta was gone. Her satchel was gone. The old, worn dress she had arrived in was gone. He ran to the barn. The old mare, a gentle, sway-backed horse he rarely used, was missing from her stall. He knew where she had gone. He knew what she was about to do. And he knew, with a chilling certainty, that he had driven her to it. Josetta rode through the night, a grim wraith dressed in a pair of Eli's old trousers and a dark shirt. She had found them in a chest, clothes he had not worn in years. They fit her loosely, allowing her to ride astride like a man. She was no longer a victim seeking shelter. She was a soldier marching to war. The town of Redemption was lit up. It was Saturday night, the night of the monthly church social. It was the one night the whole town gathered, a pretense of community and piety that Josetta knew was a lie. Her father would be there, holding court, accepting the fawning pleasantries of the people he was systematically destroying. It was the perfect stage. She left the horse in a dark alleyway and walked toward the church. The sound of a badly played piano and polite laughter drifted through the open doors. She could see the silhouettes of people through the windows, the women in their best dresses, the men in their stiff collars. She took a deep breath, her hand going to the bundle of papers tucked inside her shirt. They felt like a stone against her heart. She walked up the steps and pushed open the doors. The music stopped. The laughter died. Every head in the room turned to look at her. She stood in the doorway, a wild, dark figure, her hair a tangle of red, her face smudged with dirt, her eyes burning with a righteous fury. She saw her father standing near the pulpit, a cup of punch in his hand, a benevolent smile on his face. The smile vanished when he saw her. His eyes turned to chips of ice. She walked down the central aisle, her boots making no sound on the wooden floor. The townsfolk parted before her like the Red Sea, their faces a mixture of shock, fear, and morbid curiosity. She did not look at them. Her eyes were fixed on her father. She stopped a few feet in front of him. The silence in the church was absolute, so thick you could feel it pressing in on you. "Father," she said, her voice clear and strong, ringing through the holy space. Silas Harrow's face was a mask of cold, controlled rage. He looked at her torn clothes, her defiant stance, and he spoke one word, his voice dripping with contempt, a word designed to strip her of all dignity, to brand her in front of the entire town. "Whore!" Josetta did not flinch. She did not cry. A slow, cold smile touched her lips. She took one step forward, and she spat directly in her father's face. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Silas Harrow stood frozen, a glob of spittle trickling down his cheek. Before he could react, Josetta reached into her shirt, pulled out the oilcloth bundle, and threw it to the floor at the preacher's feet. "The truth is in there, preacher," she said, her voice ringing with power. "Let us see if this town is more afraid of God or of him." The townspeople stared, their faces pale in the lantern light, frozen in a state of terrified indecision. Harrow, his face purple with rage, slowly and deliberately wiped his cheek with a silk handkerchief. He did not look at the papers on the floor. He did not look at the preacher. He looked at his daughter with an expression of pure, unadulterated hatred. Then, his composure returned. A chilling calm settled over him. He raised his voice, not shouting, but speaking with an authority that no one in the room dared to question. "Sheriff Brody," he said calmly, "arrest this woman." The sheriff, who had been trying to make himself invisible near the back of the room, startled. He looked from Harrow to Josetta, his face beaded with sweat. "Arrest her," Harrow repeated, his voice like the crack of a whip, "for theft of private documents and for attempted blackmail." Sheriff Brody nodded dumbly, his hand going to his pistol out of sheer habit. He walked down the aisle, his face a miserable portrait of a man caught between his duty and his master. He stopped in front of Josetta, unable to meet her eyes. "Josetta Harrow," he mumbled, "you are under arrest." The first thing Eli felt when he rode into Redemption was the silence. It was a Sunday morning, a time when the town should have been filled with the chatter of families heading to church, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer taking a day of rest. Instead, a thick, watchful quiet hung in the air. People saw him coming, their faces appearing for a moment in windows before curtains were drawn, their conversations on porches halting as they turned their backs and went inside. They were afraid of him, or more accurately, they were afraid of the trouble that clung to him like dust. He did not need to ask what had happened. He rode straight to the sheriff's office, a squat, ugly building that doubled as the town jail. He swung off Gideon, his body stiff with a cold, sleepless dread. Through the barred window of one of the two cells, he saw a flash of red hair. He burst through the door without knocking. Sheriff Brody was sitting at his desk, cleaning his fingernails with the tip of a Bowie knife. He looked up, his expression one of bored annoyance. "She is not to have visitors. Carradine," Brody said, not bothering to get up. Eli walked to the cell door. Josetta was sitting on the edge of a filthy cot, her back to him. When she turned, his breath caught in his throat, a fresh bruise, dark and angry, bloomed high on her left cheekbone, uglier and more deliberate than the one she had arrived with. Her lip was split. "What did you do to her?" Eli's voice was a low, dangerous growl. "She resisted arrest," the sheriff said with a shrug. "Had to be subdued. Standard procedure. I am here to post her bail," Eli said, forcing the rage down, forcing his voice to be level. He pulled the pouch of money from the cattle trade out of his pocket. "You name the price." Brody laughed, a short, ugly bark. He finally put the knife down and leaned back in his chair, linking his hands behind his head. "There is no bail. Judge's orders. She is to be held until the circuit judge comes through next month." "Next month?" Eli stared at him in disbelief. "For what? Theft?" You and I both know that is a lie." "The charge is what the charge is," Brody said, a smug sneer spreading across his face. He leaned forward, dropping his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Between you and me, Carradine, the charge does not matter. Mr. Harrow wants his daughter humbled. He wants her to sit in that cell and think about the embarrassment she has caused him. He wants her to break. And what Silas Harrow wants, he gets. You, of all people, should know that." The open contempt in the sheriff's eyes was a clear message. This was not about the law. This was a personal punishment, and the entire town was being made to watch. Eli turned back to Josetta. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough. She just looked at him, her eyes hollow. She did not say a word. The fight, the fire, seemed to have been extinguished, leaving behind only a cold, brittle emptiness. Seeing her like that was worse than seeing the bruises. He spun away from the cell, his fists clenched. There was one last hope, one last appeal to be made within the bounds of the law, however twisted it had become. He stormed out of the sheriff's office and strode down the street to the courthouse. Judge Hallwell's chambers were opulent compared to the rest of the town, filled with leather-bound books he had never read and dark, heavy furniture. The judge was a large man, his face perpetually flushed from an excess of whiskey and self-importance. He was in the middle of pouring himself a drink when Eli entered without being announced. "Get out," the judge said, not even looking at him. "I want to know why Josetta Harrow is being denied bail," Eli said, his voice hard. "It is her legal right." The judge finally turned, a crystal glass of amber liquid in his hand. He looked Eli up and down. A slow, insulting appraisal. A small, cruel smile played on his lips. "Legal rights are for citizens in good standing. Carradine, not for thieves and blackmailers. And certainly not for women of her particular character." "She is not what you say she is," Eli bit out. "Is that so?" Judge Hallwell took a slow sip of his whiskey, his eyes glinting over the rim of the glass. He let out a soft chuckle. "A man like you, Carradine, you would not know the difference. You sleep with a whore. You start to smell like one, too." The insult was so vile, so absolute in its dismissal of them both, that for a moment, Eli could not speak. The urge to cross the room and wrap his hands around the judge's thick, wattled neck was so strong it was a physical force. But he knew it would be a death sentence. He would be shot before he took 2 steps. He stood there, his body trembling with a rage so profound it felt like a sickness. He saw with perfect, chilling clarity that the law and redemption was a closed circle. The sheriff, the judge, they were nothing but Harrow's puppets. To appeal to them was to appeal to Harrow himself, and Harrow wanted nothing but ruin. Eli turned and walked out, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. He had been a fool to think the truth printed on paper could fight this. This was a war that could not be won with words. He spent the rest of the day in the shadows, watching, planning. He saw Harrow's men, including Caleb Thorne, loitering outside the sheriff's office. A clear warning to anyone who might think of interfering. The townspeople scurried past, their eyes on the ground. The entire town was a prison, and Josetta was in its deepest cell. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Eli made his way to the livery stable. He did not go to the main entrance. He slipped through a side door into the hayloft, a place of ghosts and memories. He waited. An hour later, 2 men came in from the back pasture, their steps slow and weary. They were older, their faces lined with the harsh poetry of a hard life, their backs bent from decades of labor. Eli recognized them instantly. Jebediah Stone and Simon Fletcher. They had both worked for Harrow for more than 20 years before being cast aside. Eli had heard the stories. Harrow had foreclosed on a small plot of land that had been in Jebediah's family for generations, claiming a debt that Jebediah insisted had been paid. Simon had been fired and blacklisted from every ranch in the county for daring to speak up when Harrow had ordered a horse with a broken leg to be shot rather than treated. They were good men who had been wronged by a bad one. They were his only chance. "Jebediah! Simon!" Eli's voice came from the shadows above. The two men froze, their hands instinctively going to the knives on their belts. "Who is there?" Jebediah called out, his voice a low growl. Eli stepped into the fading light at the edge of the loft. "It is me, Eli Carradine." They relaxed, but only slightly. "What do you want, son?" Simon asked, his eyes wary. "It is not safe to be seen talking to you right now." "I know," Eli said. He climbed down the ladder, landing softly in the hay-strewn dirt. "That is why I'm here. I need your help. It is about the Harrow girl, Josetta." "We heard what happened at the church," Jebediah said, his face grim. "Heard what the sheriff did. They will not give her bail." Eli said, "Harrow means to let her rot in there, or worse." He looked from one man to the other, his gaze steady. "I'm getting her out tonight, but I cannot do it alone." The two old cowboys exchanged a long, silent look. They had a lifetime of communication in that single glance. They knew what he was asking. It was not just a crime. It was an act of rebellion that could get them all killed. "He took my land," Jebediah said finally, his voice thick with an old, cold anger. "Called my father a debtor and a liar after he was in the ground." "He treats men like animals and animals like trash," Simon added, his hand unconsciously rubbing the handle of his knife. "There is no soul in that man." Simon looked back at Eli, his old eyes clear and decided. "There is one deputy on duty tonight, a young fool named Miller who sleeps harder than a hibernating bear. The bars on that back window are old, rusted through at the bottom. A good file and some leverage. It could be done." Jebediah nodded slowly. "We will need a distraction at the saloon. A fight. Something to keep Thorne and his boys busy. The rest of the town will be too scared to stick their noses out." He looked at Eli. "You get her out. We will have horses waiting in the alley behind the blacksmiths. After that, you are on your own." "It is all I ask," Eli said, a wave of gratitude so strong it almost buckled his knees. "Thank you." "Do not thank us yet, son," Simon said, a grim smile touching his lips. "Let us see if we can live long enough to deserve it." The night was moonless, a thick blanket of clouds obscuring the stars. Redemption was dark and silent, save for the raucous noise spilling from the saloon. Just after midnight. That noise escalated into shouting, followed by the crash of breaking glass and the thud of bodies hitting the floor. Jebediah and Simon had started their distraction. Eli moved through the shadows, a ghost in the deserted streets. He carried a small bundle, a steel file, a crowbar, and a canteen of water. He reached the back of the sheriff's office, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He found the window. Just as Simon had said, the iron bars were set into sandstone that had crumbled over the years. The base of one of the bars was rusted and thin. He went to work, the screech of the file on the iron a terrifyingly loud sound in the night. He worked quickly, his muscles straining, sweat pouring down his face. It felt like an eternity, but it was probably only 20 minutes before the bar was weak enough. He wedged the crowbar into the gap and put all his weight on it. The metal groaned, then snapped with a loud crack. He froze, listening. From inside, he heard nothing but the faint sound of snoring. The deputy was asleep. He bent the broken bar back, creating a gap just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. He peered into the darkness of the cell. "Josetta," he whispered. There was a rustling sound. Then her silhouette appeared at the window. "Eli!" Her voice was a dry, cracked whisper. "I am getting you out," he said. "You have to climb through." She was weak. He had to reach in and grip her arms, pulling her as she struggled through the narrow opening. Her clothes snagged on the jagged metal, tearing the fabric. She was feverish, her skin hot to the touch, and she was shivering despite the mild night air. He half carried her through the dark alleyways, her weight a fragile burden in his arms. Jebediah was waiting with the horses, as promised. "Godspeed, Eli," the old man whispered, pressing the reins into his hand. "Ride for the high country. They will not look for you in the old mining camps." Eli helped Josetta onto one of the horses, then mounted his own. "I owe you," he said. Jebediah just shook his head. "Pay us back by making that bastard sorry he was ever born." They rode out of town, two shadows melting into the vast, dark wilderness of the surrounding hills. The shack was little more than a pile of rotting timbers clinging to the side of a steep, pine-covered ravine. It had been abandoned for decades, a forgotten relic of a gold rush that had long since busted. But it was remote, defensible, and it had a roof that mostly kept the rain out. Eli carried Josetta inside and laid her gently on a dusty cot that was missing one leg. She was delirious now, muttering things he could not understand, her body trembling with a violent chill. He started a fire in the old stone hearth, the small flame a fragile beacon of warmth in the cold, damp air. He found a bucket and filled it from a small, clear stream that ran down the ravine. With a piece of his own shirt, he began to bathe her face, her neck, her arms. The bruises on her cheek and arms were dark and ugly in the firelight. Her skin was burning. He worked silently, methodically, his touch as gentle as he could make it. He cleaned a long, shallow cut on her arm where she had scraped it on the prison bars. She was so still, so helpless, the fierce, angry woman who had slapped him, who had spat in her father's face, was gone. In her place was this broken, fragile creature, lost in a fever dream. He pulled a blanket over her and sat on the floor by the cot, watching her, listening to her ragged breathing. The night was long and filled with the sounds of the mountains, the sigh of the wind in the pines, the distant call of a hunting owl. In the deepest hour of the night, she began to cry out, her voice sharp with a pain that had nothing to do with her fever or her bruises. "No, please, no, so cold," she moaned, her head thrashing on the cot. "My boy, do not take my boy." Eli's heart constricted. He reached out and took her hand. It was hot and dry in his. "Shh, Josetta," he soothed, his voice low and rough. "You are dreaming. It is all right. I am here." She seemed to quiet at the sound of his voice, but her eyes, wide and unseeing, stared at the ceiling. She was not in the shack with him. She was back in a cold room in the east, in the middle of a blizzard. "He is so small," she whispered, tears streaming from the corners of her eyes and tracing paths through the grime on her temples. "Just let me hold him, please." He squeezed her hand, his own throat aching. He did not know what to say, what comfort he could possibly offer for a wound so deep. Her delirium broke as suddenly as it had begun. Her eyes focused on his face, a flicker of recognition, of terrible, lucid clarity, returning to them. The fever was still there, but for a moment, the dream was gone, leaving only the raw, unbearable truth. She sobbed, a deep, wrenching sound that seemed to come from the very center of her being. "I just wanted someone to choose me," she wept, her voice breaking, her words a confession of a lifetime of pain. "Just once, I just wanted to be chosen." In that moment, Eli's own heart broke. All the anger, all the resentment he had held on to for 6 years, dissolved into a wave of profound, aching love. He saw it all. The proud, frightened girl he had failed. The broken woman her father and the world had tried to destroy. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he had been a fool. He leaned closer, his face just inches from hers, and he spoke the truth that he had kept buried for so long. "I never stopped loving you, Josetta," he whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears. "Not for a single day." She stared at him, her breath catching in her throat. "You are not what he says you are," he continued, his voice fierce, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. "You are not what that bastard in the east tried to make you. You never were. You are the strongest person I have ever known, and you are not alone. Not anymore. I choose you, Josetta. I will always choose you." He leaned down and kissed her forehead, a gentle, reverent press of his lips against her hot skin. A promise, a vow. She closed her eyes, and a single tear of something that was not sorrow slipped down her cheek. She did not speak, but her hand tightened its grip on his, and she finally, truly, slept. The next morning, her fever had begun to subside. She was weak, but her mind was clear. They sat by the fire, sharing a meager breakfast of coffee and hardtack. The events of the past days hung between them, a shared trauma that had forged a new, unbreakable bond. "The documents are gone," she said, her voice hoarse. "The preacher probably gave them right back to my father." "It does not matter," Eli said. Abernathy was right. "The papers are not enough. We need people. We need the ones your father hurt to stand up and speak the truth." A plan began to form. A desperate, dangerous gamble. They would not run. They would fight. They would find the victims of Harrow's land grabs. The widows, the freedmen, the small ranchers he had squeezed out. They would gather their testimonies. "He will not let that happen," Josetta whispered. "He will hunt us." "Let him," Eli said, his jaw set. "We will not hide forever." He did not know that, back in Redemption, Silas Harrow was standing on the steps of the church. The entire town gathered before him. He did not know that his face was a mask of cold fury, that his voice was like the crack of a whip as he addressed the crowd. "My daughter has been led astray by a coward and a thief," Harrow announced, his voice carrying in the still morning air. "She has been abducted from the custody of the law. There is a bounty, $500 for her head, and double." He paused, his cold eyes sweeping over the crowd. "For the cowboy who turned my daughter into trash." The high country air was thin and sharp, a tonic that slowly leached the fever from Josetta's blood. In the 2 days they spent in the mining shack, a quiet strength returned to her limbs, and the haunted, broken look in her eyes was replaced by a familiar, steely resolve. Eli's confession, whispered in the dark of that derelict cabin, had been a balm on a wound she thought would never heal. He had chosen her. The knowledge was a shield, an armor she had never known she could possess. But it was not a victory. It was merely the strength she needed for the battle to come. They left the shack at dawn on the 3rd day, riding not south toward the open plains, but deeper into the rugged, forgotten corners of the county. Their destination was Black Hollow, a narrow, shadowed valley tucked between 2 unforgiving mesas. It was a place where people went when they had nowhere else to go. A small, marginalized community of freedmen, poor farmers, and outcasts who had been pushed to the very edge of the map by men like Silas Harrow. As they rode, the landscape grew harsher, the pines giving way to gnarled juniper and scrub oak. The trail was little more than a goat path winding through a maze of red rock and dry creek beds. It was a place built for hiding, for being forgotten. They found the settlement at the valley's end, a small cluster of rough-hewn cabins and a tiny, whitewashed church with a crooked steeple, a few chickens scattered at their approach. An old man sitting on the porch of the church, his hair a cloud of white around a dark, deeply lined face, watched them with weary, intelligent eyes. He held a Bible in his lap, its pages worn thin with use. "Can we help you?" the old man asked as they dismounted. His voice was a low, melodic rumble, like stones rolling in a deep river. "We are looking for Reverend Josiah Green," Eli said, his hand resting near the butt of his pistol, his eyes scanning the quiet settlement. "You have found him," the man said, his gaze settling on Josetta, on the unmistakable color of her hair. He showed no surprise, only a deep, abiding sorrow. "You must be the girl," he said softly, "Silas Harrow's daughter." "My name is Josetta," she said, stepping forward, her voice clear and steady. "And I need your help." "Reverend," We need your help." They sat on the rough wooden steps of his church as the sun began to dip behind the mesa, painting the sky in fiery colors. They told him everything. They told him about the documents, about the bounty, about the town held silent by fear. Then, Josetta looked the old preacher in the eye and spoke of the names she had memorized from her father's letters, names of people who had once lived here, in this very hollow. "I read about a man named Samuel Gable," she said, "and his wife, Sarah. My father's letters said they sold their land to him, the plot at the mouth of this valley." A shadow passed over the Reverend's face. "Sarah Gable lives 2 cabins down," he said, his voice heavy. "But Samuel did not sell his land. He loved this ground. He died on it. A fire. They said a terrible accident. It took their barn, their home, and Samuel with it. Sarah was left with nothing but ash. A week later, your father's men came with a deed, claiming Samuel had sold it to them the day before he died. She had no choice but to sign it over and move back here, to what little land our community could spare." He led them to Sarah Gable's cabin as twilight settled, the air growing cool. Sarah was a thin, stooped woman with hands gnarled by work and grief. At first, she was terrified, refusing to even look at Josetta, the daughter of the man who had destroyed her life. But as Josetta spoke, her voice filled not with the arrogance of a hero, but with a quiet, burning empathy. The woman's fear began to recede. "He took everything from me," Sarah whispered, her eyes fixed on the flickering flame of an oil lamp. "My Samuel, he was a good man. He would never have sold, never—" "We know," Eli said gently. "We believe you, but we need you to tell your story, not just to us, to the whole town." Sarah shook her head, her body trembling. "They will kill me, Harrow's men. They will come for me." "They will have to come through me first," Eli said, his voice a low promise. "And me," Josetta added, placing her hand over the older woman's. "We cannot let him win. We cannot let him bury the truth with the good men he has destroyed." It was a long night. The Reverend Green went from cabin to cabin, his presence a comfort and his reputation a key. Eli and Josetta followed, 2 determined ghosts in the darkness. They spoke to a family of dirt farmers who had been run off their land by a sudden, inexplicable plague that killed their cattle, a plague that started the day after they refused Harrow's low offer. They listened to an old prospector who had been beaten half to death and had his claim jumped by men he recognized as Harrow's. Each story was a fresh wound, another testament to the quiet, brutal tyranny that had ruled the valley for years. Many were afraid, their fear a palpable thing in the small, crowded cabins. They had seen what happened to those who crossed Silas Harrow. But as the night wore on, something began to shift. The sight of Josetta, her father's own blood, standing before them and denouncing him, was a powerful catalyst. Their individual embers of resentment, long banked and smothered by fear, began to glow. If she, who had the most to lose, was willing to fight, then perhaps they could too. By the time the sun rose, they had a small, terrified, but resolute army. Reverend Green, Sarah Gable, and 3 other men who had lost everything. They were outcasts, the forgotten, the people Harrow had deemed worthless, and they were about to become his reckoning. They rode back toward redemption under the cover of the next night, a small, grim procession moving through the darkness. Their plan was audacious, bordering on suicidal. Sunday sermon was the only time the entire town was gathered, a captive audience in the house of God. It was their only chance to speak the truth to everyone at once, before Harrow's power could isolate and silence them one by one. They tethered their horses in a thicket a half-mile from the church and approached on foot, moving through the shadows like wraiths. The sound of hymns drifted on the morning air, a strangely peaceful sound for the war they were about to start. They waited at the back of the church, hidden from view, their hearts pounding in a collective rhythm of fear and anticipation. Eli stood beside Josetta, his hand resting on the small of her back, a silent, steadying pressure. "You do not have to do this," he whispered, his voice for her ears alone.
"Yes,"
she whispered back, her eyes fixed on the church doors.
"I do."
They waited until the sermon was over, until the final Amen had been spoken. Then, as the congregation began to stir, preparing to leave, Eli pushed the heavy doors open. A collective gasp went through the church as they stepped inside. Eli, a fugitive with a price on his head, and Josetta, the woman who had spat in the face of power. They walked down the aisle, and this time, the townsfolk did not just part. They shrank back, their faces a mixture of terror and awe. Behind them, in the doorway, stood the small, silent group of witnesses from Black Hollow, their presence a quiet accusation. Josetta did not stop until she stood before the altar, in the very spot where the preacher delivered his sermons on morality and damnation. She turned to face the crowd, her gaze sweeping over the sea of familiar faces, the shopkeepers, the ranchers, the wives, the children. She saw Sheriff Brody by the door, his hand on his gun. She saw Judge Hallwell in the front pew, his face turning a blotchy red. And she saw her father, standing, his face a thundercloud of pure, murderous fury. Her voice, when she began to speak, was a mere tremor, a fragile sound in the vast, silent church. "My name is Josetta Harrow," she began, her hands trembling. "Most of you have known me my whole life. You knew me as a girl who wore fine dresses and rode a fine horse. You knew me as the daughter of the most powerful man in this county." She took a breath, and her voice grew stronger, drawing power from the truth she was about to unleash. "But you do not know the woman I am now, and you do not know the man my father truly is." She told them her full story. She spoke of being sent east, of the forced marriage to a man who saw her not as a wife, but as a piece of property. Her voice did not waver as she spoke of the cold, loveless house, of the nights filled with a quiet terror. She spoke of the baby boy she had lost to a winter storm and a cold heart. And then, she did something no one expected. She unbuttoned the cuff of her sleeve and pushed it up, revealing the long, jagged scar on her forearm.
"This is a memory of my husband,"
she said, her voice ringing through the church.
"A reminder of what happens when a man believes he owns you."
She did not have the bundle of papers, but she had saved one single, damning letter, one she had hidden in the lining of her boot. She held it up now.
"And this,"
she cried, her voice rising,
"this is a memory of my father, a letter in his own hand ordering Sheriff Brody to handle a widow who would not sell her land, a woman whose husband had died in a fire my father's men set."
A murmur went through the crowd. People began to stir, to look at each other, to look at the sheriff, whose face had gone pale. Some shouted in her favor, cries of shame and "let her speak." Others, still in her father's pocket or in his debt, yelled back, "Liar!" and "harlot!" The church was no longer a place of quiet worship. It was a tinderbox about to explode. Then, Silas Harrow began to walk down the aisle. He moved with a slow, deliberate menace, his footsteps echoing in the tense silence. He was like a serpent, coiled and ready to strike, his eyes fixed on his daughter with a look of pure venom. He did not speak. He walked right up to her, and in front of the entire town, in front of the altar of God, he drew back his hand and slapped her across the face. The crack of the blow silenced the room. Josetta staggered back, her hand flying to her cheek, a red welt already rising on her skin. In that instant, something in Eli snapped. With a roar of pure rage, he stepped forward, his Colt peacemaker appearing in his hand as if by magic. He leveled the barrel directly at Silas Harrow's chest. "Do not touch her again," Eli snarled, his voice a low, deadly promise. Immediately, two of Harrow's hired guns, including Caleb Thorne, drew their own weapons, their guns trained on Eli. Sheriff Brody, his face slick with sweat, unholstered his pistol, his hand shaking as he pointed it vaguely in Eli's direction. The church had become a powder keg, a single gunshot away from a massacre. Townsfolk screamed and scrambled for cover, diving under pews. "Put the gun down! Carradine!" the sheriff yelled, his voice cracking. "Not until they put theirs down," Eli countered, his gaze never leaving Harrow. It was the town preacher, a timid man named Reverend Miller who had been cowering behind the pulpit, who finally found his voice. "Enough," he cried, his voice surprisingly powerful. "There will be no more violence in the house of the Lord." He stepped forward, placing himself between Eli and Harrow, a scrawny, unlikely shield. His eyes, usually so mild, burned with a righteous fire. "We have heard the accusation," he declared, his voice ringing with newfound authority. "Now let the truth be heard." He turned and looked toward the back of the church. "Let the witnesses speak." A silence fell, thick and heavy with anticipation. Then, from the back of the church, Reverend Josiah Green began to walk down the aisle, his old Bible clutched in his hand. He walked with a slow, dignified grace, his gaze fixed on Silas Harrow. "I am a man of God," the old preacher said, his voice filling the church. "And God does not abide a liar. I was there the day Samuel Gable died. I saw the smoke, and I saw 2 of your men, Mr. Harrow, riding away from the flames just as they began. You called it an accident. I call it murder." A gasp went through the crowd. Before Harrow could respond, Sarah Gable stepped forward, her small frame trembling but her voice clear. "He took my land," she said, pointing a gnarled finger at Harrow. "He put a piece of paper in front of me when I was half mad with grief, and he made me sign it. He stole my husband's legacy." One by one, the others from Black Hollow came forward. A farmer told of his cattle being poisoned. The old prospector showed the scars on his face from the beating he had taken. Each testimony was a hammer blow, shattering the foundation of fear upon which Silas Harrow had built his empire. The powerful, broken voices spoke a truth that was undeniable, a truth many in the room had long suspected but had been too afraid to admit. The mood in the church shifted. The murmurs of doubt turned into growls of anger. The fear that had held the town in its grip for so long was burning away, replaced by a hot, cleansing rage. Men who had been silent for years were now on their feet, shouting curses at Harrow. Silas Harrow's face, for the first time, showed a flicker of fear. His control was gone. The town was turning on him. He took a step back, then another, his eyes darting toward the side door. He was going to flee. He never made it. A rancher, a man whose water rights Harrow had stolen years before, lunged forward and threw a punch. Harrow staggered back, and the church erupted into chaos. It was no longer a standoff. It was a brawl. Fists flew as townsfolk who had been victimized by Harrow and his men finally vented their years of frustration. In the confusion, Harrow scrambled out the side door into the street, but Eli was on him in an instant. He tackled him from behind, and the 2 men went down in the dusty street, a tangle of limbs and flying fists. All of Eli's rage, all his pain from the last 6 years, for the love he had lost, for the life he had been denied, for the suffering Josetta had endured, came pouring out. He was a man possessed, his knuckles bloodying Harrow's face. He wrapped his hands around Harrow's throat, squeezing, the world narrowing to the sight of the terrified, bulging eyes of the man who had ruined his life. He was going to kill him. Then, a hand was on his shoulder. "Eli, no!" It was Josetta, her voice cut through his red haze of fury. He looked up at her, his vision clearing. She was standing over him, her face bruised and tear-streaked, but her eyes clear and strong. "Do not become him," she said, her voice soft but firm. "His punishment is not to die. It is to live with what he is. Let him rot in shame." He stared at her for a long moment, his hands still tight around Harrow's throat. Then, with a shuddering breath, he let go. He stood up, leaving Silas Harrow a gasping, broken mess in the dirt. The fight was over.
The truth was out, and in the middle of the street, surrounded by the wreckage of her father's reign. Josetta stood not as a victim, but as a victor. The chaos in the street outside the church did not die down quickly. It transformed from the hot, explosive rage of a brawl into the grim, simmering anger of a mob. Men stood over the gasping, broken form of Silas Harrow, their faces hard in the morning light, their hands still clenched into fists. They had been silent for too long, and now that the silence was broken, a flood of righteous fury poured out. It was Sheriff Brody, his face ashen and his authority shattered, who inadvertently saved Harrow's life. He and the one deputy who had not fled pushed through the crowd, their pistols drawn but not aimed. "Stand back," Brody shouted, his voice thin and reedy. "He is under arrest. He will face the law." A man laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "You are his law, Brody. You are as guilty as he is." The crowd surged forward, and for a moment, it seemed that they would tear all three men apart. It was Reverend Miller, the town's timid preacher, who once again found a strength he never knew he had. He stood on the church steps, his arms raised. "Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord," he thundered, his voice booming with the authority of the scriptures. "This man will not be a martyr. He will be a prisoner. He will face justice, not in the heat of anger, but in the cold light of day. We will not become the monsters we seek to destroy." His words, and perhaps the sheer exhaustion of the moment, calmed the crowd. The anger remained, but it was a cold, hard anger now, the kind that would last. They let the sheriff and his deputy haul the battered Silas Harrow to the jail cell his daughter had just vacated. It was not an act of legal authority. It was an act of caging a rabid animal to protect it from the hunters. The town's reckoning was swift. That afternoon, a delegation of ranchers and townsfolk, led by the surprisingly resolute Reverend Miller, confronted Sheriff Brody. They did not threaten him. They simply stood before his office, their faces set like stone, and waited. By evening, Brody had packed a single bag, saddled his horse, and ridden out of Redemption without looking back. He was a man without a master, and therefore a man without a purpose or a place. Judge Hallwell's departure was even less dramatic. He did not wait to be confronted. He was seen loading a carriage in the dead of night, his fine leather-bound books and crystal glasses packed away. He was gone before the sun rose, a coward fleeing the consequences of his own corruption. The house of cards that Silas Harrow had built with fear and money had collapsed in a single morning. In the days that followed, a fragile, uncertain order began to assert itself. A temporary council was formed, with Reverend Miller and a few of the more respected ranchers at its head. They sent for a federal marshal to oversee the legal tangle that Harrow had left behind. In the midst of this turmoil, the council summoned Josetta. They met in the church, the air still thick with the memory of her stand. They offered her a settlement. As Harrow's only heir, she was legally entitled to his vast estate. They proposed that she take control of the main ranch, the house she grew up in, and a significant portion of the land, with the rest to be investigated and redistributed. She stood before them, not in the torn, borrowed men's clothes she had worn to the fight, but in a simple dress she had sewn herself, her hands now calloused and capable. She listened to their offer, her expression calm and unreadable. When they were finished, she gave them her answer. "I thank you for your consideration," she said, her voice clear and strong. "But I cannot accept. I did not do this to reclaim my father's land. I did it to reclaim my own name." She looked at the faces of the men on the council, men who had known her as a spoiled child and then as a disgraced woman. "That name is Josetta. It is not Harrow. I want nothing that belongs to him. His land, his money, his house. They are all poisoned by the things he did to acquire them. Let the estate be used to pay back the people he stole from. Give the land back to those who worked it and loved it. I do not want his legacy. I want to build my own." She walked out of the church, leaving a room of stunned, silent men behind her.
Eli was waiting for her on the steps, his horse and hers saddled and ready. He had watched her through the open door, his heart swelling with a pride so fierce it was almost painful. He had never seen anyone so brave. They rode out of town without a backward glance, leaving the politics and the legal battles to others. They rode toward the small, scarred piece of land that was Eli's, the one place that felt like it belonged to them. The sun was warm on their backs, and the air was clean. When they reached the cabin, the sight of the broken door and the wreckage inside was a stark reminder of the violence that had brought them to this point. For a moment, they just stood there, surveying the damage. Eli turned to her, his face serious. "Josetta," he began, his voice rough with an emotion he could not name. "This is not much, a small cabin, a few acres of stubborn dirt, but it is a place to start. There is a place for you here, beside me." He reached out and took her hand, his calloused thumb stroking her knuckles. "But only if you want it, freely, with no debts and no promises you do not want to make." She looked at their joined hands, then up at his face. She saw the question in his eyes, the vulnerability of a man laying his entire world at her feet. A soft smile touched her lips. "I do not need rescuing, Eli," she said softly. "I have had enough of being rescued and enough of being owned." She squeezed his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "But if you will walk beside me," she said, her gaze steady and clear, "I will never run again." He did not need any other answer. He pulled her to him, and their kiss was not one of desperation or solace, but of a deep and settled joy. It was a kiss of beginnings, of promises made and kept. They started rebuilding the next day. The work was hard, but it was a good kind of hard. It was the work of creation, not destruction. Together, they mended the broken door. Eli sawing the wood and Josetta hammering the nails with a newfound confidence. They swept out the broken pottery and, with clay from the nearby creek, she fashioned new, simple cups and bowls, lopsided and imperfect, but made with their own hands. They were more beautiful to him than any fine china. They spent their days outside, under the vast blue sky. They worked on a new fence, digging the post holes, stretching the wire taut. Each post they sank into the earth felt like an anchor, securing their future, defining a space in the world that was theirs alone. They worked in a comfortable silence, their movements synchronized, a silent dance of two people who understood each other without the need for words. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, watching the sunset paint the valley in shades of purple and gold. They talked for hours, filling in the 6 years of silence. He told her of his lonely, wandering years, of the anger that had almost consumed him. She told him more of her time in the East, not just the pain, but the small moments of defiance, the books she had secretly read, the small ways she had kept a part of herself alive. They were laying down the foundations of a new story, a story that belonged to both of them. Their intimacy returned, not with the frantic, desperate hunger of their first nights together, but with a slowness and a softness that spoke of healing. One night, as they lay by the fire, the cabin filled with a warm, flickering light, he gently took her arm. He traced the line of the jagged scar on her forearm, his touch as light as a feather. She did not flinch. She watched him, her eyes soft in the firelight. He leaned down and pressed his lips to the scar, a soft, lingering kiss. It was an act of acceptance, of love for the parts of her that were damaged, for the history that had made her who she was. He was not trying to erase her pain. He was honoring her survival. He looked up at her, his eyes dark with emotion. "I will lie beside you for as long as you ask," he whispered, his voice thick. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow. She pulled him close, her lips finding his in a kiss that was a quiet promise of 1,000 nights to come. As the last remnants of winter gave way to the first green shoots of spring, a rider came out from town with news. The federal marshal had arrived, and the process of untangling Silas Harrow's affairs had begun. The council, with the marshal's authority, had started the process of returning the stolen land. Sarah Gable was to get her husband's plot back. The families from Black Hollow were being given clear titles to their land, and reparations from the Harrow estate. The reign of fear was truly over, and a season of justice had begun. The news settled a deep and lasting peace in Josetta's heart, but she found that her own story was not finished. She rode into the new settlement at Black Hollow, where families were beginning to rebuild. She saw the children, their faces bright with a future their parents had never dared to dream of, and she saw a need. She began to teach in the small, crooked church, with slates and chalk paid for by Eli's last cattle sale. She taught the children of the victims how to read and write. She taught them that words had power, that a signature on a page could be a weapon or a shield. She was giving them the tools that she had been denied, the tools that might have saved her from her own fate, in helping them reclaim their dignity. She found a purpose that was wholly her own, a purpose born not of pain, but of hope. The final scene of their story did not happen in a crowded church or in a dusty street. It happened on a quiet night, months later. The cabin was whole, the fences were strong, and the land was beginning to show the promise of a spring planting. Eli and Josetta stood outside, leaning against the new fence posts they had set that afternoon. The sky was a vast expanse of dark velvet, scattered with a brilliant spray of stars. The air was cool, and Josetta was wrapped in Eli's old, familiar work coat, the scent of him a constant comfort. She leaned her head back against his shoulder, her gaze lost in the infinite depth of the night sky. "You ever think about who we used to be?" she asked, her voice a soft murmur in the stillness. "That girl in the blue dress? That angry boy who promised her the world?" Eli was quiet for a long moment. He pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her from behind, his hands resting on hers on the fence rail. He pressed his cheek against her hair. "Only when I hold you like this," he whispered. "Only then do I remember how lost I was without you." A slow, genuine smile spread across her face, a smile of pure, unadulterated peace. She turned in his arms to face him, her hands coming up to cup his jaw. The starlight caught the silver in her eyes. "Then lie with me like you mean it," she said, her voice soft. Not a question, not a plea, but a statement of fact, of a love that had been forged in fire and had come out stronger than steel. He lifted her into his arms and carried her inside, laying her gently on their bed. He laid down beside her, the past forgotten, the future unspoken, but finally, blessedly, theirs. Thank you for listening to our story around the campfire tonight. Let us know in the comments where you are listening from so we can all connect. And be sure to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.